Hi, this is Laurie Marks, the Associate Director of the Writing Proficiency Office. This is part 2 of the October 2021 WPE workshop. I just want to start by reminding you about these resources to help you to complete your challenge essay for the October portfolio. We're holding writing labs on the 18th and 19th. You just can drop in and work on your paper and get advice from a tutor at any point in the process of writing that paper. In addition, on October 20th and 21st, you can get feedback from a member of the staff on a draft of your challenge essay. You do have to schedule an appointment. However, all you're doing is just scheduling a half hour of the staff person's time during which they will review your essay and send you comments by email. Details about both of these opportunities are sent to you in an email message on every Friday. For this workshop, here's what we plan to do. First, I just suggest that you take out your copy of the reading set or open it up on your computer screen and take notes. I will always give you page numbers of the different places in the reading set that I'm talking about. So first I'm going to talk about just what these readings are. Then I'll talk about this kind of thinking and kind of writing called synthesis, which is what you need to do when you work with these essays to produce your own essay. I'm going to talk about how you can use these essays to help you to define these two key terms, memory and identity. Then I'm going to look at each essay in turn and discuss what is the purpose and what is the major conclusions of each essay. In particular, how that essay can be relevant to your own project. Finally, I'll give a more detailed discussion of the Dillard essay, because we think that that essay is probably the most difficult, not necessarily difficult to read, but it may be difficult for you to figure out how to make use of it in your own essay. These 4 short essays all are written by academics. All but one of these essays are intended to be read and understood by regular people, that is, people like you and me. The first essay, by Askold Melnichuk, is a personal essay that was published in the Boston Globe. Melnichuk is a professor in the English department here at UMass Boston, and he's an award-winning fiction writer. The second essay, by Noam Spencer, was published by Psychology Today, which is a magazine that explains and explores psychological issues and psychological health for a general public. Spencer is practicing psychology and is a professor of psychology. The third essay, by Cynthia Dillard, was published in a collection of academic essays. Books like this are usually focused on a central issue of interest to academics, and academics are their primary audience. However, Cynthia Dillard's writing style is unconventional for an academic. And although she does use sources, her essay explores the implications of a personal experience in Ghana and what it reveals about being an academic researcher. Finally, we have an essay by Juliana Mazzoni, which was published on a website called The Conversation. This site only publishes writing by academics, but its essays are intended for a general audience. Mazzoni is a professor of psychology. In your essay, you're required to use and explicitly refer to all of these essays except for the one by Melnichuk. Using the Melnichuk essay is optional. None of these readings are directly answering the question in the prompt. That question is, how are we and our people defined by what we remember and forget? The readings are relevant to this prompt, but it's up to you to put the pieces together and see what they add up to. This kind of writing is called a synthesis. So, a synthesis is a written discussion incorporating support from several sources of differing views. Also, explaining these key terms, that is, memory and identity, will help you to better understand how complex both memory and identity are. I suggest that you devote a paragraph in your essay, possibly even two, to explain your topic to your reader by explaining what memory and identity are. And you can use the essays by Spencer, Dillard, and Mazzoni to give you lots of material with which you can put together an explanation of these concepts. So what I've given you here is an example of how you might incorporate an explanation into your own essay, which includes a quotation from Spencer. So imagine that this is in a paragraph in your paper in which you're explaining what memory is. Spencer and Mazzoni both explain some of the complexities of memory. Spencer writes that because our brains select, tweak, and rearrange the materials of our experience into coherent and meaningful accounts, memories are in effect fictional narratives. Page 6. This means that we don't record our experiences accurately and so on. However, do be careful. It's actually pretty easy to give an explanation of a concept, especially when you're pulling from sources to help you to do that. But don't get distracted into thinking that this can be your entire paper. It should be at most just a couple of paragraphs of your paper, because you don't want to get distracted from answering the real prompt. If your essay is not focused on explaining how memory and identity are connected to each other, then you're not going to pass. So now I'm going to give you a brief review of each of these essays and then finish with a longer review of Dillard's essay. Askold Melnichuk's essay is called Remembering and Forgetting. And in this piece, Melnichuk describes his mother reading to him and to his father while Melnichuk is preparing a meal for them. While he's doing this, he meditates on the importance of books to his mother throughout her life, and how this importance has persisted even though his mother's now experiencing some sort of cognitive decline that affects her memory. This essay doesn't have a clear sense of purpose because it is a narrative, but you can use it as an interesting example. For your project, you might interpret this narrative to be about memory and identity. I've given you a couple of examples of questions you might investigate in working with this piece, such as, when a person doesn't remember very well, did she cease to be herself? And how does something that happened in the past to one's parents or relatives contribute to one's own identity? Noam Spencer's essay, Our Memories Ourselves, is mainly about memory, and his essay can be a useful source for you to explain what memory is and how it works. He also discusses pretty briefly how memory and identity overlap with each other. And that certainly can give you a starting point for your own essay. His essay is pretty informally written and doesn't have an identifiable thesis, but I've selected a couple of sentences from page 6 that together sort of seem to cover the topic. So those sentences are, the most profound aspects of our selfhood are dependent on memory, but our current knowledge of the brain is insufficient to allow a clear view of how memory works. So this is an interesting dilemma here that our sense of ourself depends upon our memory, but at the same time, excuse me, we don't know how it works, at least not very well. So, relevance to your project. Spencer does give some interesting and accessible information on memory and goes a long way to explain why our memories can be so unreliable. So here's some questions you might be able to address using Spencer's essay. How does memory work? What makes memory complicated? And what is the role of forgetting? So if forgetting is a part of remembering, as Spencer suggests, then that implies that you may have something to say in your essay about forgetting. I'm going to skip Dillard for now and talk about Masonis' essay. Like Spencer's essay, hers addresses the connection of memory to identity. But in her case, she's primarily focused on identity and why the connection between memory and identity is difficult and problematic. I think her essay appears on page 12. She writes, memories shape a person's identity, but identity is often not a truthful representation of who we are. So even though memory is a source of identity, our identity isn't very accurate. Part of the reason for this is that memory is unreliable. And part of it is that we actually choose to remember the things that support our identity, not who we really are, but who we want to think we are, or who we want to present ourselves as. So here are some questions that may help you to make use of this essay. How is identity complex? How is the relation between memory and identity complex? And what are false memories, selective memories, and memory distortions? Now I'm going to discuss Dillard's essay in greater detail. Dillard's essay is titled, Learning to Remember the Things We've Learned to Forget. And her essay does make a connection between remembering and forgetting that is very important to identity. Although her essay is very informally constructed, I think she comes close to having a thesis on page 9 when she says, what I would like to do in this chapter is to make visible the spiritual, cultural, and ritual memories that are necessary to appreciate the complex and contested spaces and places of Black women's lives. So, how is this thesis or project relevant to your own project? There's two key ideas that I think you can bring away from her essay. First, this idea that memories are situated in culture and in history. And second, that what other people remember or forget shapes our identities. Dillard begins her essay with a personal narrative, which should tell you right away that this is an unconventional academic essay. She's an African American woman doing academic research in Ghana, and an old woman in the outdoor market is completely perplexed by the sight of her. This woman can't fit Dillard into any of her familiar categories and asks, "What is she? Is she a white woman?" This peculiar interaction throws Dillard into a tailspin, and she gives us some text from her journal entries that show what she was thinking. How could she see me as a white woman? Couldn't she see the African woman I could see in myself? Didn't she know what had happened to millions of Africans who'd been forcibly taken from the shores of Ghana and other West African countries? Different readers will have different responses to this experience that she described. But I think we can all see that one thing that happens here is that Dillard's lifelong sense of her own identity was suddenly challenged because of what someone else thought of her. I think this is a good illustration of how our identity depends to a degree on what other people think. To be able to get a grip on Dillard's thinking, I suggest that you think yourself about a time you were misidentified. For example, I have been misidentified as a man a few times by people who then apologize frantically when they realize their mistake. I always thought their anxiety was puzzling. I wasn't sure why they thought I'd be offended. Once, a man who did get a good look at me said that I was a gentleman for holding the door for him. I took this as a compliment, and it made me really think about how, for women, there's no linguistic equivalent of gentleman. Calling someone a lady doesn't really mean the same thing at all. All of these experiences revealed a lot about what other people were thinking and assuming when they categorized someone as a man or a woman. Another thing you might want to consider is the interesting fact that Dillard's identity depends upon a history that she herself did not experience. This history is a cultural memory, one that's embedded in the cultural, ethnic, or racial history of a group of people. Again, if you think, you may realize that your own identity is based in cultural memories. Perhaps you have family stories like those my grandparents told me about how my family came to America, or some of the memorable things they did. For example, my grandmother, Viola Sharpless, my great grandmother, Viola Sharpless, used to plow the fields with a Colt 45 revolver stuck in her skirt's waistband so that she would be ready to fight off bandits. Similarly, our identity is based in a history of our country or countries. By the way, when Dillard was in Ghana, the people of one village staged a ceremony for her in which she was given a Ghanaian name, and Dillard actually continues to use both names. So here's how Dillard explains that experience. She writes on page 9, "This story and so many others created and lived by Black women everywhere make visible the spiritual, cultural, and ritual memories that are necessary to appreciate the complex and contested spaces and places of Black women's lives." Although I'm not a Black woman, and I can only guess what it's like to have the history of slavery be part of my identity, I do have some aspects of my identity that are complex and contradictory, and I even have some that I'm not proud of. So I could relate what Dillard is saying about her identity to what is true about my own identity. Dillard quotes one of her sources, Busia. Busia wrote, "Meaning within our memories becomes what we can read and what we can no longer or could never read about ourselves and our lives." Dillard is making the point that our identity is subject to change, and that part of that change may come from learning something that has been forgotten. For example, due to genetic and historical research, some people are discovering that they're not related to the people they think of as family, or that they have a race or ethnicity that they never suspected, or that they have a surprising family history. Even though these discoveries don't change your own personal narrative, they can have a profound effect upon how you think of yourself in the world. However, remember that Dillard is writing to an audience of academics, and this is the message she gives them. Teaching and research must also undertake an often unnamed, unrecognized, unarticulated, and forgotten task that is important for individuals who yearn to understand ways of being and knowing that have been marginalized in the world and in formal education. She's emphasizing that teachers and researchers throughout their work should bring marginalized people into education. It's personally important for the researchers because it would help to give them a richer identity, particularly if they themselves are marginalized. But it's even more important for students who may find themselves represented in education, perhaps for the first time, by a teacher or researcher who has done this work. So here's what Dillard concludes on page 11. She says, "Our memories are based in a sense of connective and collective time, from which we both recognize our identities and from which we can transform those identities." Dillard emphasizes that memory is powerful and relevant, and therefore the history or cultural memories that have been forgotten need to be reclaimed. The woman in the marketplace who didn't recognize that Dillard was a woman of African descent did recognize Dillard the next time she saw her, and she greeted her in English, saying, "Morning, Black American lady." The woman has come to understand something about her own history of Ghanaian people being transported against their will to be slaves under horrible conditions and to never return to their home country. And by recognizing this history in Dillard, she has also helped Dillard's identity to stabilize. Dillard is indeed an African and American woman, and now she has a new sense of her own identity and her place within history. I hope that this brief review of Dillard's essay will help you to see how you can work with her ideas, to observe something of how identities are created and recreated, and to understand that memory isn't only the things you happen to remember, but also is the stories that you remember. This is similar to Melnichuk's mother, who is shaped and influenced by the need to flee Poland during the rise of Nazism. And to Melnichuk himself, who probably doesn't actually remember his family's experiences as refugees, but who can claim those experiences as part of his identity. This is the end of this brief review of the reading set. I just want to emphasize again that you can contact us at our email address or call us. The email address is writing.proficiency@umb.edu, and the phone number is 617-287-6330.